James had spent months on the alien planet of Virelia, working as an engineer on a human diplomatic project. The world was unlike anything he had ever seen. Towering crystalline structures stretched into the sky, glowing softly under the planet's twin moons. The air shimmered faintly with an energy his human senses couldn't fully grasp, but he had gotten used to the strange atmosphere. His quarters were a rare luxury. Unlike the cramped living spaces he had been assigned on other off-world stations, this one was spacious, almost regal. The Virelians had strict social structures, and because James worked closely with their royal technology, they had given him a room deep inside their grand halls. Privacy was something the aliens valued greatly, and he had grown accustomed to the solitude. After a long shift, James finally let out a sigh and loosened his uniform. He tossed his datapad onto the sleek, levitating desk, its holographic interface still flickering with unfinished calculations. His mind was still running through the modifications he had been assigned, but exhaustion pulled at him. He decided to take a moment for himself, stepping toward the refresh unit to clean up. Just as he was about to remove his undershirt, a faint chime echoed through the room, his door's security system giving a warning. Before he could react, the door slid open on its own. James turned sharply, his pulse spiking. The door wasn't supposed to open unless he authorized it, and he certainly hadn't done that. The thought barely had time to register when two figures stepped inside. They weren't just anyone. They were Virelian twins. Their presence alone was shocking enough. James had only ever seen them from a distance. The Virelians, an elegant and highly intelligent species, rarely interacted with humans outside of formal diplomatic events. But these two were more than just any Virelians. They were royalty, daughters of the ruling High Matron, known for their telepathic gifts and their untouchable status within their society. And now, they were standing in his room. James froze, unsure if he should speak, move, or even breathe. The twins were identical in every way, slender, with pale violet skin that shimmered faintly under the room's soft lighting. Their silver eyes were wide with something between shock and horror. Their long flowing hair, a deep shade of blue that darkened toward the ends, swayed slightly as they took a step forward in perfect sync. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, they gasped in unison. James had no idea why they looked so horrified, but their expressions sent a cold shiver down his spine. He raised his hands, trying to appear non-threatening. I think there's been some kind of mistake. My door wasn't supposed to." Before he could finish, they both let out an alarm sound, something between a whisper and a sharp intake of breath. The taller of the two suddenly turned and slammed her hand against the wall, pressing a control that James hadn't even noticed. A loud, echoing alarm blared through the room. Panic surged through him. The walls around him pulsed with a deep red glow, a color he had never seen before in the Virelian halls. Footsteps pounded in the corridors outside. Guards. James barely had time to process what was happening before a group of heavily armed Virelian sentries stormed in, their glowing weapons trained directly on him. "What the hell?" James blurted out, raising his hands higher. "I didn't do anything." The twins stood frozen, their gazes locked onto him. One of them whispered something in their native tongue, a soft, melodic language that James couldn't understand, but he caught the way her voice trembled. The lead guard, a towering Virelian male with a scar running across his cheek, snapped out a command, and before James could react, he was seized. Strong arms clamped down on him, dragging him toward the door. James struggled. "Wait, what is this about? I didn't do anything. I was in my room. They walked in on me." His protests fell on deaf ears. He caught one last glimpse of the twins, their silver eyes flickering with an emotion he couldn't decipher. One of them, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something, watched him in silence as he was yanked from his quarters. The last thing he saw before the doors slammed shut behind him was the way the twins stared after him, their expressions unreadable. And then, As the guards hauled him down the hall, James realized something chilling. They weren't afraid of him. They were afraid for him. James had no idea where they were taking him. The moment the guards had dragged him from his quarters, everything became a blur of twisting hallways and unintelligible shouts in the Virelian language. The smooth, crystalline walls of the palace pulsed faintly with energy, reflecting the red emergency lights that still flickered overhead. The entire scene felt surreal. His heart pounded as he struggled against the firm grip of the two sentries holding him. Their hands, though humanoid in shape, were unnervingly cold, as if they weren't flesh and blood at all, but something else entirely. Every attempt to slow them down was met with a sharp tug, forcing him forward. James wasn't a stranger to interspecies diplomacy. He had spent years working in alien environments, learning their customs, understanding their ways. But this made no sense. He had done nothing wrong. The twins had walked into his quarters. If anyone should have been in trouble, it was them. And yet, the look on their faces, the sheer horror in their silver eyes, told him this was something bigger than a simple misunderstanding. The guards led him through a high arched doorway that sealed shut the moment they passed through. The temperature in the new chamber was colder, and the walls hummed with a strange, static-like energy. There were no windows, no visible exits apart from the one they had entered through. James barely had time to take in his surroundings before a deep voice echoed through the room. "Restrain him." Before he could react, his body was forced down onto his knees. A heavy, glowing band was locked around his wrists, humming with unfamiliar energy. He gritted his teeth as he felt a tingling sensation race up his arms. It wasn't painful, but it sapped his strength like his body was suddenly weighed down. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward. Unlike the guards, this Virelian was dressed in ornate robes, layered in flowing silks that shifted colors as he moved. His face was lined with age, his deep violet skin darker than that of the twins. A high-ranking official. James swallowed hard. "Listen, I don't know what's going on, but this is a huge mistake. I didn't do anything." The alien raised a hand, and James's voice vanished. No pain, no sensation, just sudden, complete silence. He tried to speak again, but nothing came out. "I know exactly what happened," the elder Virelian said, his silver eyes studying James with unreadable intensity. "The question is, do you?" The weight of his words sent a chill down James's spine. This wasn't just a diplomatic issue. This was something far worse. Before James could even attempt to sign his frustration, the chamber doors hissed open once more, and the twins entered. They walked in slow, their movements careful. Unlike before, they no longer looked horrified. But they weren't calm, either. They exchanged a brief glance before standing side by side, facing the elder. One of them, James wasn't sure which twin it was, spoke first. "He doesn't know." Her voice was soft, but it carried through the room with an almost unnatural resonance. The elder let out a long breath, as if confirming something to himself. "Then we have a problem." James clenched his fists. He was getting tired of being talked about rather than to. He shot the twins a sharp look, hoping to silently demand some kind of explanation. One of them hesitated before speaking again. "We walked in on you," she admitted, her silver eyes locking onto his. "At the wrong time." James frowned. What did that mean? What wrong time? It wasn't like he had been doing anything. He had been standing in his room alone. The elder turned toward him. "You are human. You do not know our ways, our customs." His voice was measured, almost cautious. "If you had, you would have never allowed yourselves to be seen like that." James's frustration only grew. "Seen like what?" he demanded, though his words still made no sound. His face twisted in frustration, and one of the twins glanced at the elder before giving a small nod. The elder sighed and snapped his fingers. "Just like that," James's voice returned. "Seen like what?" James repeated, this time louder. "I was in my own room. I didn't invite you two in. You entered. What am I supposed to have done wrong? For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the second twin, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke. In our culture, she began, her voice slower, deliberate, to be seen in a place of solitude, by one of our kind, means you are bonded. James blinked. The words didn't register immediately. Bonded. The elder inclined his head. It is an unbreakable vow. A heavy silence filled the room. James's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Bonded. Unbreakable vow. That was absurd. There was no way something so extreme could be the consequence of a simple accidental intrusion. That doesn't make sense, James said, shaking his head. It was a mistake. That's all. A misunderstanding. The twins didn't look away. If anything, their gazes grew more intense. We know it was a mistake, one of them admitted. But that doesn't change anything. James clenched his jaw. So what are you saying? That because you walked into my room, without permission, mind you, I'm suddenly tied to you forever? That's ridiculous. The elder's expression remained unreadable. To you, perhaps. To us, it is sacred law. James opened his mouth to argue again, but the weight of the situation started to settle in. He could see it in their eyes. The twins weren't joking. The elder wasn't exaggerating. They truly believed this. James exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Okay, he said, forcing himself to stay calm. Let's say I don't want this. What happens then? A strange tension filled the air. The elder did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the twins, who hesitated before lowering their heads slightly. James's stomach twisted. He didn't like that reaction. What happens? He repeated, his voice quieter now. The elder finally spoke. Then they will be banished. James's blood ran cold. What? One of the twins met his gaze again. This time, there was no unreadable mystery in her expression. Just quiet, resigned truth. If you reject the bond, she said, voice barely above a whisper, we lose everything. James sat there, staring at them, feeling the walls closing in around him. For the first time since this nightmare began, he realized that his choices didn't just affect him. James had never felt more trapped in his life. The weight of the Virelian elder's words echoed in his mind, growing heavier with every passing second. If he rejected the so-called bond, the twins, who had done nothing wrong, would be banished, cast out from their people, stripped of their status, possibly even exiled to a world where they wouldn't survive. All because of one mistake. His hands curled into fists. This wasn't fair. He hadn't chosen this. He hadn't asked for any of it. The twins stood before him, their identical silver eyes filled with a quiet, unwavering seriousness. They weren't pleading. They weren't begging. It was worse than that. They were simply waiting, waiting for his response, waiting for him to decide their fate. The elder remained still, watching James as if he were some unpredictable force of nature, as if one wrong move would shatter the fragile balance of whatever ancient traditions he had unknowingly disturbed. James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. This is insane, he muttered under his breath. The taller twin, at least she seemed taller by half an inch, spoke first. It is the law. James let out a bitter laugh. The law. He shook his head. The law says that just because you two walked in on me, I'm suddenly bound to you for life. That's not a law. That's a trap. The second twin finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. It is not a trap. It is a tradition older than our written history. James paced, his boots clicking against the smooth crystalline floor. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. Okay. So let's say I go along with this. What does bonded even mean? Is this some kind of marriage thing? A servitude deal? Am I supposed to be your personal bodyguard? His voice was sharp, edged with frustration. What does it actually mean? The elder folded his hands together, his expression unreadable. It means you are tied to them. Your existence and theirs are now linked. The bond is unique. It is neither marriage nor ownership, yet it is not without its consequences. James felt a chill creep down his spine. What kind of consequences? The twins hesitated. This time, the shorter one spoke first. You will begin to feel what we feel. James frowned. What? The elder nodded, as if confirming something he had already expected. The bond has already started. It will grow stronger. You will sense their emotions as they sense yours. And if it deepens further, he paused. You may even hear their thoughts. James's breath caught. No, that was impossible. Humans weren't telepathic. They had no biological capabilities for mind reading. He shook his head, rejecting the idea outright. That's ridiculous. That can't happen. One of the twins blinked slowly. It already is. James opened his mouth to argue. But before he could even form the words, something hit him, a strange sensation, like a ripple across his mind. It wasn't a thought, not exactly. More like a whisper of emotion that wasn't his own. A flicker of nervousness, uncertainty, something almost too fleeting to grasp. His stomach dropped. His own reaction must have shown on his face, because the shorter twin took a step closer, watching him carefully. You felt it, didn't you? James took an unconscious step back. No. That wasn't real. It had to be in his head. Maybe the stress was getting to him. Maybe this whole absurd situation was messing with his mind. The elder's voice was calm, but there was something knowing in his tone. It is real, human. The process has begun. James refused to believe it. He clenched his fists. Then how do I stop it? Silence. That was a bad sign. A very bad sign. The twins glanced at each other before answering, and James hated the way they hesitated, as if they were afraid to tell him. Finally, the taller twin spoke. You cannot. James felt like the floor had just been ripped out from under him. No, he said, shaking his head. No, there has to be a way. There is not, the elder said firmly. Once the bond is formed, it cannot be undone. It will only grow. James's mind reeled. He felt sick. He had spent his entire life making his own choices, carving out his own path. And now, because of some outdated alien tradition, he was bound to two strangers he barely knew. His voice came out rough. So what happens if I just leave? Walk out of here and never come back? The room went deathly still. One of the guards shifted uneasily. The elder let out a breath, slow and measured. Then the bond will turn into a curse. James stiffened. What? The connection will become unbalanced. The pain of separation will consume you. He met James's eyes, and for the first time, there was something grim behind his gaze. You will not die, but you will wish you had. James couldn't breathe. The weight of those words settled on his chest like a crushing force. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. His hands curled into fists. There has to be a way, he said, more to himself than anyone else. The shorter twin, the one who had been quiet for most of the conversation, took another step forward. She looked at him with something softer than the others had. Not pity, not sympathy, something else. There is one way, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But you will not like it. James's pulse hammered. He didn't care if he liked it. He needed a way out. What is it? He demanded. The twin exhaled slowly. The only way to break the bond is death. The words hit James like a physical blow. He went still. The elder inclined his head. And now you understand. A silence stretched between them. James felt like the air had thickened, like it was pressing down on him. This was worse than a prison sentence, worse than anything he could have imagined. His mind screamed for a way out, some kind of loophole, some kind of solution. But deep down, he already knew. There wasn't one. The bond was permanent. James had no choice but to live with it. And worse, he had no idea what it would turn him into. James had never been one to panic. Years of working in high-pressure environments had taught him to stay calm, to think logically even when everything around him seemed like it was crumbling. But this was different. This wasn't just a difficult situation. This was a cage with no key. The elder had spoken with finality, as if James's fate had already been sealed. The twins had remained silent after their last words, watching him with careful, unreadable expressions. But James wasn't ready to accept this. He refused to believe there was truly no way out. His breathing came uneven as he forced himself to think. If this bond was real, if it was already affecting him, then he had to understand how far it went. What were its limits? Could he resist it? Could he control it? He took a step back, shaking his head. "This is insane," he muttered. "There's no way some random rule can just take over my life like this." The elder folded his arms. "It is not a rule. It is a force of nature." James scoffed. "That's what people say when they don't understand something. Just because it's always been this way doesn't mean it has to stay this way." One of the twins, the slightly shorter one, tilted her head. "Are you saying you believe you can break it?" James hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know, but he'd be damned if he didn't at least try. "I'm saying I'm not going to roll over and just accept it." A strange look passed between the twins. Not amusement, not frustration. Something else, something curious. The elder, however, simply sighed. "You are not the first to fight the bond, human. All who have tried before you have failed." James narrowed his eyes. And how many of those people were human? The elder went silent. James felt a flicker of hope, small but defiant. Humanity was different. They had survived the impossible before. Why should this be any different? Before anyone else could speak, the guard suddenly stiffened. A sharp chime echoed through the chamber, some kind of incoming transmission. One of the sentries turned toward the elder and spoke in a low, urgent voice. James couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the shift in atmosphere immediately. Something was happening. The elder's expression darkened as he turned to the twins. "It seems word of your bond has already spread." James didn't like the sound of that. "So," the elder exhaled, as if tired. "So, there are those who wish to test you." A chill ran down James's spine. "Test me." The taller twin finally spoke again, her voice quiet. "You are an anomaly." James swallowed. He already didn't like where this was going. The elder nodded. "There has never been a human Virelian bond before. It is unnatural. Some believe it should not be allowed to continue." James let out a bitter laugh. "Well, hey, we actually agree on something." The elder ignored him. "If you are to remain bound to them, you must prove you are worthy of the connection." James's amusement vanished instantly. "What does that mean?" The room was silent for a moment. Then, the elder gave a slow nod to the guards. A moment later, James's restraints disengaged. The glowing cuffs around his wrists snapped open and clattered to the floor. James immediately took a step back, flexing his fingers as feeling rushed back into them. His instincts screamed at him to run, but even if he wanted to, where would he go? He was in the heart of an alien palace, surrounded by people who could probably hunt him down with ease. Instead, he forced himself to stay still, to listen. The elder's gaze was heavy. "A trial has been set." James frowned. "A trial." The taller twin spoke again. "A test of strength, intelligence, survival." James's stomach dropped. "You've got to be kidding me." The elder remained unmoved. "If you refuse, the bond will be considered unworthy, and both you and the twins will be cast out." James's jaw clenched. "And if I pass?" The elder's silver eyes gleamed. "Then you will have proven that humanity was meant to stand beside the Virelian bloodline." James felt like the floor had vanished beneath him. This was so much worse than he had imagined. Not only was he trapped in this situation, but now he had to fight to stay in it. A slow realization crept over him. This wasn't just about him anymore. If he failed, it wouldn't just be his life ruined. The twins, who had been raised in a world of privilege, of safety, would lose everything. He exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He hated this. He hated being backed into a corner. But what choice did he have? The twins were watching him closely, their expressions unreadable. But James could feel something from them. Not fear, not pity. Trust, as if they already believed he would succeed. James clenched his fists. He had been thrown into a fight he never asked for. But if he was going to do this, he was going to win. James had never been a warrior. Sure, he had been in his fair share of fights, some bar brawls, a few scrapes during his time working off-world, but nothing that had ever been a matter of life and death. Now, standing in the center of the massive Virelian arena, he realized just how much of a disadvantage he was at. The chamber was colossal, larger than any structure he had ever seen, carved from a single piece of crystalline rock that shimmered under the artificial lights. High above him, on an elevated platform, sat the ruling Virelian council, their silver eyes gleaming as they watched in eerie silence. To his left, the twins stood side by side, their expressions carefully neutral. They had tried to warn him, tried to explain how these trials worked. But there was only so much they could say before they were forced to step back and let him face this alone. James exhaled, rolling his shoulders, feeling the weight of the moment press against him. He didn't even know what the trial was going to be yet, but one thing was certain. If he failed, he wouldn't just be failing himself. The twins would lose everything. And he had no doubt that the Virelian elders would ensure he never left this planet alive. A deep, resonant chime echoed through the arena. The air rippled, the walls humming with unseen energy. Then, from the far end of the chamber, a gate slid open. James's breath hitched. A creature emerged. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its body was long, sinuous, covered in overlapping plates of deep violet chitin. 4 glowing, blade-like appendages jutted from its back, each one pulsing with an unnatural light. Its eyes, all 6 of them, locked onto him instantly. James didn't need an explanation. This was the first test. He had to survive. The creature moved with unnatural speed, lunging toward him before he had even fully processed what he was looking at. His instincts took over. He barely managed to dodge to the side, rolling across the hard stone floor as one of the creature's bladed arms slashed through the space where he had been standing a second ago. James scrambled to his feet, heart pounding. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "This is happening." The creature didn't hesitate. It pivoted on its hind legs, its massive tail whipping through the air in an attempt to knock him off balance. James leaped back, barely avoiding the strike. He needed a weapon, something to defend himself with. His eyes darted across the arena. The walls were smooth, featureless. No obvious weapons. No way out. Think, James. Think. He couldn't fight this thing head-on. It was too fast, too strong. But maybe he didn't have to. James focused, trying to push aside his fear. He had noticed something. The way the creature hesitated between attacks, the way its glowing appendages pulsed right before it struck. It was telegraphing its moves. He could use that. The creature lunged again. This time, James didn't dodge immediately. Instead, he waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, then sidestepped at the last moment. The beast's momentum carried it forward, its bladed arms slamming into the ground. It was fast, but it wasn't agile. James acted before it could recover. He kicked off the ground, grabbing onto one of the creature's blade-like limbs. Using its own movement against it, he twisted his body, wrenching the appendage in a direction it wasn't meant to go. A loud crack echoed through the arena. The creature let out a deafening screech, stumbling backward as its damaged limb twitched uselessly. James hit the ground hard, rolling away before it could retaliate. His breathing was ragged, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had heard it. Not much, but enough to prove that he could win. From the platform above, murmurs rippled through the council. The elder leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. The twins, however, looked almost impressed. The creature wasn't done. It recovered quickly, its remaining limbs shifting, adapting. The glow from its appendages grew brighter, and suddenly, James felt something shift in the air. Then, without warning, a blast of pure energy shot from the creature's limbs. James barely had time to react. He threw himself to the side, but the blast still grazed his arm, sending a jolt of searing pain through his body. He hit the ground hard, gritting his teeth as he forced himself up. The creature could fire projectiles now. Great, fantastic, amazing. James clenched his fists. He couldn't keep dodging forever. He needed a way to end this. Then suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind. "You are thinking too small." James froze. That voice, it wasn't his. His gaze snapped toward the twins. They were staring at him. The bond. James hadn't even thought about it since the fight began, but now he could feel them. Their emotions, their thoughts, brushing against the edges of his mind. And they were trying to help. The shorter twin spoke, but her lips didn't move. "You cannot defeat it with strength, but you can outthink it." James didn't have time to question it. He let it happen, let their thoughts flow into his mind. The creature lunged again. But this time, James wasn't reacting blindly. He moved with precision. He could see it, not with his eyes, but with something deeper. The way its energy pulsed, the exact second before it would strike. The bond was showing him its weaknesses. James moved before the creature could. He sidestepped effortlessly, reaching out at the perfect moment. His fingers wrapped around a small, jagged piece of broken kitten, a shard that had snapped off during their fight. A weapon. The creature turned, its 6 eyes locking onto him. But this time, James was faster. He leaped, driving the shard into the creature's exposed joint. The result was instantaneous. The creature collapsed, its body shuddering violently. The energy that had been pulsing from its limbs flickered, dimmed, then vanished. Silence filled the arena. Then a loud chime rang out. The trial was over. James staggered back, chest heaving. The creature lay motionless. He had won. Above him, the elder stood, his expression unreadable. The twins, however, smiled, not just with satisfaction, but with pride. James exhaled slowly. He had passed the first test, but something told him the worst was yet to come. James had barely caught his breath when the arena shifted around him. The air thickened with a strange hum, the walls pulsing faintly with an energy he still didn't understand. The creature he had defeated lay motionless on the ground, its body twitching as the last remnants of its power faded. He knew better than to relax. This wasn't over. High above, the council murmured among themselves, their silver eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite read. Disapproval, curiosity, fear. He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. He had surprised them. The elder finally stood. "You have survived the first trial," he announced, his voice calm yet firm. "But survival is not proof of worth. The bond must be tested further." James clenched his jaw. Of course, there was more. There was always more. A deep chime echoed once again, and before James could even process what was happening, the arena shifted. The ground beneath him trembled. He took a step back as crystalline walls rose from the floor, forming an intricate labyrinth of glowing corridors. The once open arena had transformed into something completely different. A maze. James exhaled sharply. He had no idea what the rules of this trial were, but he had a feeling they weren't just going to let him walk out of here. "The second trial begins," the elder continued, his gaze unwavering. "You will navigate the labyrinth. But beware, this is no ordinary test of navigation. It will challenge not just your body, but your mind. James frowned. And what exactly does that mean? The elder didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the twins. James turned to face them, and the moment he met their eyes, he felt it. A pulse of energy surged through his skull, not painful, but overwhelming. His vision blurred for a moment, and then, the world around him shattered. James stumbled, gasping as the walls of the maze seemed to twist and stretch, warping into impossible shapes. The floor beneath him felt unstable, shifting like liquid even though he knew it was solid. His mind swam with sensations that didn't belong to him. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like wind brushing against his ear. But they grew louder, voices overlapping, clashing, filling his head with words that weren't his. You do not belong here. You are an anomaly. Turn back before it's too late. James squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his palms against his temples. What the hell was this? He forced himself to focus, breathing deeply. This wasn't real. It was some kind of illusion, a trick, a test, just like they had said. Then, suddenly, laughter. Not just any laughter. His own. James's eyes snapped open. And there, standing in front of him, was himself. A perfect replica. Same stance, same clothes, same tired yet determined look. But there was something off. The other James smirked, his posture more relaxed, more casual. Look at you, the copy said, tilting his head. Thinking you can beat this. Thinking you actually have a choice. James didn't move. He had seen a lot of strange things in his life. But this was on a different level. Let me guess, the copy continued, crossing his arms. You think if you just push through, fight hard enough, you'll find a way out of this mess. Break the bond. Go back to your normal life. James swallowed hard, refusing to speak. The copy's smirk widened. But we both know that's not happening, don't we? James clenched his fists. He had no idea what this was. Some kind of hallucination, a psychic projection, something triggered by the bond. But he wasn't about to stand here and let it get in his head. I don't have time for this, he muttered, stepping forward. But the copy moved with him, mirroring his steps perfectly. James stopped. The copy stopped. James took a slow step to the side. The copy followed. Annoyance prickled at his nerves. Great, so I have to fight myself now. Is that it? The copy chuckled. You're not getting it, are you? He gestured toward the labyrinth around them. This isn't about fighting. It's about understanding. James frowned. Understanding what? The copy's expression darkened. That you're already changing. James stiffened. The copy took a step closer. You feel it, don't you? His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. The bond. It's not just connecting you to them. It's changing you. James's heart pounded. It started small, the copy continued. You could sense their emotions, then their thoughts. But where do you think this ends? Do you really believe it just stops? James gritted his teeth. It's a connection. That's all. The copy shook his head. No, it's merging you with them. James opened his mouth to argue, but deep down, he knew it was true. He could feel it. He had felt it in the fight, when he moved not just by instinct, but by intuition. He had reacted faster than a human should have, moved with knowledge he shouldn't have had. Because of the twins, the bond was more than just a mental connection. It was something deeper, something he didn't understand. And if it kept growing. James took a step back, shaking his head. No, I'm still me. The copy simply smiled. Are you? Before James could respond, the maze around him shattered. The copy was gone. James gasped as reality snapped back into place. He was standing in the same corridor, the walls of the labyrinth stretching before him. But something had changed. He looked down at his hands. For a brief moment, his skin flickered, just for a second, like it wasn't entirely solid. His stomach twisted. He didn't have time to think about it. A sound echoed through the corridors. Footsteps. Someone else was in here. James moved. He didn't know where he was going, but his instincts pulled him forward. The maze twisted and shifted, yet somehow he knew which turns to take. He wasn't lost. Somehow, he could feel the right path. And that terrified him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the end. A final door stood before him, carved with glowing symbols. James hesitated. If he stepped through, he would prove himself worthy. He would complete the trial. But what if the trial wasn't about winning? What if it was about acceptance? About embracing the bond? His hands trembled. He wasn't ready for that. But there was no turning back. With a deep breath, James stepped forward and crossed the threshold. James stepped through the threshold, expecting something, anything, to happen. A surge of energy, a final challenge, maybe even another illusion to test his resolve. But instead, he was met with silence. The chamber beyond was unlike anything he had seen before. The walls were no longer crystalline but dark, as if carved from obsidian, pulsing faintly with an unseen power. The air was thick with something he couldn't name, pressing against his skin like an invisible force. It wasn't oppressive, not entirely, but it carried a weight that felt final. The twins stood waiting for him. They were alone now, their usual calm expressions replaced with something else. Expectation, maybe even relief. The way they looked at him sent a shiver down his spine, not out of fear, but because he felt something stir within him. A connection that had been growing, creeping into his mind like vines wrapping around stone. He swallowed hard. I passed your test. The shorter twin, he was beginning to realize he could actually tell them apart now. Nodded. You did. James exhaled sharply, tension still lingering in his shoulders. So what now? Am I worthy enough to not be executed? The taller twin tilted her head slightly. That was never the question. James frowned. What are you talking about? The door behind him sealed shut, the sound echoing like the closing of a tomb. His pulse spiked. Hey, I thought I was done. You are, the shorter twin said gently. But the trial was not just about survival. It was about completion. James stared at her. Completion of what? Neither of them answered right away. Instead, they stepped closer in unison, their silver eyes locked onto him with something he couldn't decipher. And then, he felt it. A flood of emotion, thought, memory. Not his. Theirs. It wasn't just words in his mind anymore. It wasn't just feelings brushing at the edges of his consciousness. This was deeper. Like he had been standing on the edge of an ocean this whole time, only dipping his hands into the waves. But now the tide had pulled him in. James staggered. He saw glimpses of their past, their childhood, their fears, their hopes. He felt their loneliness, the weight of their status as royal heirs. He saw the nights they had spent looking up at the sky, wondering about the stars, about the universe beyond their world. And most of all, he felt their certainty in him, in the bond, in the fact that, from the moment they had walked into his room, this had never been a mistake. This had been fate. James's breath hitched. He didn't believe in fate. He believed in choices, in forging his own path. But this felt undeniable. The twins reached out at the same time, their hands hovering just inches from his. You are no longer just James, the taller one whispered. You are something more, the other added. James didn't move, didn't speak, because he knew they were right. He had changed. The bond had changed him. He could feel it in the way his body reacted before his mind could process things, in the way he knew what they were thinking without them having to say a word. And now, he had a choice to make. He could reject it, fight against what he had become, or he could accept it. Accept them. The silence stretched. James took a slow breath. Then, finally, he raised his hands. and placed them in theirs. The moment their skin touched, the connection solidified. A final, irreversible step. Power rushed through him, not in a violent, overwhelming surge, but in a way that felt right, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. The twins' silver eyes glowed, and James could feel everything. Not just their emotions, their souls. His breath shuddered. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted, his voice raw. The twins held his hands firmly. "You are James. You are ours." And somehow, impossibly, that felt right. The doors to the chamber opened, and James knew he would never be the same again.